Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to be discussing water, hydrogen bonding, and how that all comes together to make water a really important molecule in human physiology. So water is what we can understand to be the most important inorganic molecule in the body, and of course in a previous video we defined an inorganic substance as being anything that does not contain both carbon and hydrogen, so water definitely applies there. And we've also seen that water is the most common kind of molecule that you're going to find in the human body, period. So the importance of water in supporting life and all the neat things that we're going to be talking about this semester, we can really tie to its unique chemistry, which we're going to talk about now. So water, of course, is H2O, and this involves a single oxygen atom that is joined to two hydrogen atoms by covalent bonds. So if you look at the chemistry of an oxygen atom, oxygen has 6 valence electrons. Those are the outermost electrons in the outermost shell. So if 2 of these valence electrons are shared with the 2 hydrogen atoms, that's going to leave 2 sets of unpaired electrons, which you can see illustrated here and here. The other 2 sets of electrons are actually tied up in these covalent bonds between oxygen and hydrogen. Now, the idea here of what's going to be important about water is that these unpaired electrons actually take up space, even though you might not think of it that way. So what this is going to do is it forces the geometry of the water molecule to become bent with bond angles of 104.5 degrees. Now, if you think about water as being a single molecule that only contains 3 atoms, you might actually expect the water molecule to be linear, kind of like how carbon dioxide is. So if water were linear, it would have bond angles of 180 degrees, but that is not the case. So the important thing to understand here is that because of the presence of those unpaired electrons, all the electrons, both paired and unpaired, want to get as far away from each other as possible. So this is what contributes to the fact that water is bent rather than linear. So another very important thing to understand here is that that oxygen atom is very electronegative. Electronegativity we can understand to mean an atom's desire, for lack of a better term, for electrons. So oxygen desires electrons a lot more than either of those 2 hydrogens do. So the result of oxygen being more electronegative than hydrogen is that the electrons being shared between them in those covalent bonds are going to be drawn a lot more towards the oxygen, so we can think of this as the electrons being shared unequally. The result is that we are going to actually have dipoles. These are vectors of attraction of these bonded electrons in the direction of the electronegative atom. You can think of the electrons between oxygen and each of the 2 hydrogens as being shared, but these dipole arrows are telling us that these electrons are being attracted more towards the oxygen than they are towards the hydrogen. So another way of thinking about this is that those negatively charged electrons, and it's important to remember that electrons are negatively charged, those electrons are going to spend a lot more time around the oxygen atom than they will around either of the 2 hydrogen atoms. And the final result of this, again keeping in mind that electrons are negatively charged, is that you're going to end up with a polar water molecule. On one end, you're going to have partial negative charges because those electrons are concentrated in this region here. And then with your 2 hydrogen atoms, you're going to have partial positive charges. In that regard, you can think of it as, well, those electrons are not spending very much time down here, so you actually have a concentration of positive charge down here because these hydrogen nuclei still have their positively charged protons, but the electrons that would usually counterbalance that positive charge are not spending so much time down here. They're actually spending more time up here. So water, as a polar molecule, is going to have one pole that is partially negatively charged and the other pole which is partially positively charged. And this polarity is going to greatly contribute to some of the unique properties of water that are going to make water so good and appropriate for doing what it does in human physiology. Now, before we go any further, you should understand that these partial charges are relatively weak compared to full electrical charges that you find in ionic compounds or full ions like sodium, potassium, bicarbonate. Those are full electrical charges, +1 for sodium, +1 for potassium, -1 for bicarbonate. So these are fractions of charges, so they're not quite as strong as what you find in full ions. But as charges, as electrical charges, they still operate on the principle of electrostatic attraction, and that is that positive charges are attracted to negative charges. So that is going to be how we get hydrogen bonds, which is the nature of these electrostatic attractions between molecules that have these partial electrical charges. So these attractions, these hydrogen bonds, occur between partially positive hydrogen atoms and partially negative oxygen or nitrogen atoms. Usually, in most cases, hydrogen bonds are going to be formed between water and something else, but if you have another polar molecule like this ammonia molecule here, you can also get hydrogen bonding in that way. So every single green dotted line here represents a unique hydrogen bond that is formed between a partial negative and a partial positive. Now, a couple of things to get out of the way about hydrogen bonds, things that are important for you to understand. Number one, proximity matters. Atoms have to be close by in order for hydrogen bonding to occur. You cannot get hydrogen bonding to occur over a great distance. The two involved atoms have to be close together. Number two, a single hydrogen bond is actually very weak and fairly easy to break either with mechanical force or by increasing the amount of thermal energy, usually by increasing temperature. So if hydrogen bonds are very weak and very easy to break, what good are they, you might be wondering? Well, that brings us to our third point. Networks of hydrogen bonds in which you have hundreds, thousands, millions of hydrogen bonds all occurring at the same time between a limited number of molecules, that actually gives the entire network of molecules a great deal of collective strength, and it might be easy to break 1 or 2 hydrogen bonds, but to break thousands, if not millions, if not billions of hydrogen bonds, that's going to be a lot harder to accomplish. So you can actually get a great deal of collective bonding strength if you have a lot of hydrogen bonds. We can actually see 2 specific examples of this. Number one, hydrogen bonds are a very important force that holds DNA strands together. We'll talk about DNA a little bit in a future video, but you probably are already familiar with the idea that 2 strands of a double helical DNA molecule are held together by hydrogen bonding between the nitrogenous bases that make up each nucleotide. So the base pairing you see here is between adenine and thymine, and then guanine and cytosine. In each case, the forces that are holding these 2 yellow strands of DNA together are the hydrogen bonds. 2 hydrogen bonds between A and T, and 3 hydrogen bonds between G and C. Just on the basis of the number of hydrogen bonds, you can hopefully appreciate that the GC bond is a bit stronger than the AT bond. Additionally, hydrogen bonding is also a very important force that holds proteins together. And again, we will have a whole video dedicated to protein structure and protein folding in the future. But you can see here that hydrogen bonding is an important part of what keeps proteins bound together and keeps them functional. You can't really see it so much in this illustration here, but again, we will be covering this in much greater detail in a future video. Okay, so let's talk more about hydrogen bonding and how this leads to some of the unique properties of water itself. So the polarity of water and its capacity to form hydrogen bonds explains all the unique properties of water, including, but not limited to, cohesion and adhesion. Cohesive forces are the forces that hold water molecules together, and adhesive forces are the forces that hold water molecules onto other surfaces. Number 2, hydrogen bonding and polarity gives water a high surface tension, so this is biologically important in a lot of different ways, including bugs and other lightweight organisms that like to walk on the water surface. Number 3, water has a very high heat capacity, so it takes a lot of thermal energy to change the temperature of water. And this is a very important concept in thermoregulation. When we sweat, we can get rid of a lot of pent-up heat in the body by using that heat to evaporate water on the surface of the skin, and that's how sweating works. And number 4, hydrogen bonding accounts for the fact that ice is less dense than water. For pretty much every other substance out there, the solid is actually going to be more dense than the liquid form of that substance, but not for water, and it's all because of hydrogen bonding. So these 4 properties of water are all very interesting, but the 5th one that is not listed here just yet, which is most relevant for human physiology, is that water is a good biological solvent. So this is going to lead into a discussion on solutions, and this is going to kind of play off of what we talked about in a previous video with our different bodily fluids, intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. So a solution is a uniform mixture of a liquid solvent and any dissolved solutes. In this regard, water is what we would consider to be the solvent. So you can see in this illustration here that we have a container that contains liquid water, and then you can see a variety of different solid solutes that have dissolved into the water. So a solute must become dissolved, and in that regard, you know it has become dissolved when it becomes indistinguishable from the solvent itself. So if you ever try to make up a solution of salt water, you know exactly how to tell that the salt has actually dissolved in. You can't see any solid chunks at the bottom anymore. The salt has become indistinguishable from the water itself. So the thing to consider here is that a true solution is really only possible if all the solutes dissolve in the solvent itself. And this is going to lead to future discussions on solubility, which is a very, very, very important concept in human physiology. And since water is what we accept to be the universal solvent in all biological systems, we're going to want to consider individual solutes on the basis of whether they can or will dissolve in water. So the question then becomes, and this is going to be hopefully what ties everything together for us, how does water dissolve a potential solute? And if you've been paying attention so far, you should come up with the answer, which is with hydrogen bonding. Solutes that are soluble in water are going to be solutes that water will interact favorably with by using hydrogen bonding, that electrostatic attraction that we talked about before. So in that regard, biological solutes that we could potentially find in living systems come in 2 very important varieties. You have what we call the hydrophilic or water-loving solutes. These are the ones that will dissolve very well in water because they interact well with water and they can form hydrogen bonds with water, or they can in some way interact with water through electrostatic attraction. And then you have the hydrophobic or water-fearing solutes. These are molecules that do not dissolve in water because they do not interact well with water. In that regard, they lack electrical charges and they really don't provide anything that water can attach onto. So if we start with the hydrophilic solutes, we understand that because hydrogen bonds work on the principle of electrostatic attraction, any hydrophilic solutes must themselves have electrical charges, either full electrical charges in the case of ions and salts, or partial electrical charges in the case of polar compounds like sugars. So some examples of hydrophilic solutes are, of course, salts. These are substances that dissociate into positively and negatively charged ions when you put them into solution. Or you could have just other polar molecules, molecules that behave very similar to water. So polar molecules are going to be coated with partial charges that water can actually form hydrogen bonds with. So if we start by considering salts, because hydrogen bonds work on the basis of these electrical attractions, as we said before, salts are a good candidate for interacting well with water because they actually prevent full positive and negative charges. So like we said, a salt is an ionic compound that can dissociate in water into their respective ionic components. Here, you're looking at a salt crystal that is made up of individual negatively charged chloride ions and individual positively charged sodium ions. So when you actually throw that salt crystal into a beaker of water, the water is actually going to start tearing apart the salt crystal, and instead of the sodium and chloride interacting together, now you've got individual sodium and chloride ions interacting with the partial positive and negative charges of the water molecules themselves. So the salt in this regard will dissolve in water because the polar water molecules help to disrupt those ionic bonds in favor of forming hydrogen bonds. And the thing that you should notice here is that the partially positive hydrogen atoms are pairing with the fully negative chloride ions, and the partial negative oxygen atoms are pairing with the fully positive sodium ions. So water molecules in a salty solution, though, will not be able to form as many hydrogen bonds with each other, so the network of hydrogen bonds between water molecules themselves will become weaker. And if you're interested, this is the basis of why adding salt to water actually causes the boiling temperature to go down, because you have fewer hydrogen bonds to break. And adding salt onto an icy road actually causes the ice to melt at a higher temperature. It's all on the basis of reducing the number of hydrogen bonds that you have to deal with. Okay, so now let's talk about polar molecules, which are also hydrophilic solutes. So water, of course, will also interact favorably with other polar molecules, and usually your best examples of this are sugars and alcohols. So because these solutes also have partial charges, they can actually form hydrogen bonds in very much the same way that water does. So in the case of glucose here, and in the case of ethanol, they both have these types of chemical groups called hydroxyl groups, which we will talk about in a future video. But basically, these OH groups that you see here, these are actually built by using polar covalent bonds. So that's going to cause the oxygen atom to have a partial negative and the hydrogen atom to have a partial positive. So that forms a ripe formula for creating new hydrogen bonds, and that makes these compounds here, both glucose and ethanol, very soluble in water. So if you actually see these compounds interacting with water, you can see exactly how this works. The individual water molecules are attracted via hydrogen bonding to those polar groups that actually litter each of these molecules that you see here. So this is the basis of what makes a solute soluble in water. Water has to be able to form electrostatic interactions with that compound itself. And we, of course, understand the electrostatic interaction water forms to be the hydrogen bond. Now, as for the hydrophobic solutes, these are solutes that are built mostly using nonpolar bonds, the bonds that do not involve unequal sharing, but rather equal sharing of electrons. So since nonpolar molecules do not have any full or partial charges to work with, there's really nothing that water can interact with. You can think of it as water has nothing to grab onto. So some prominent examples of hydrophobic solutes are gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen, lipids like fats, steroids, and waxes, and we'll have a video dedicated to lipids in the future, and then fibrous proteins, which are folded in a way that really discourages interactions with water, and we'll learn more about that in the future as well. But if we want to take an example here of 3 hydrophobic solutes and we're trying to dissolve them in water, physiologically important gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they of course have very low solubility in body fluids because they don't interact well with water, but we of course understand that oxygen and carbon dioxide have to be a part of living systems, so there has to be some sort of way of transporting them around in spite of the fact that they are not very soluble in water. So there is a solution to that, but we will talk about that in a different video. So for now, let's focus on this other molecule here, C8H18. This is actually the same octane that you find in your gasoline. This is a completely nonpolar molecule, so it is going to have nothing that water likes to grab onto. So if we try to add octane into a solution of water, we're not going to be able to get a solution to form. The octane is just not going to mix together with the water. So instead, what we're going to see is a formation of two distinct layers, with the less dense hydrophobic layer being on top and the more dense aqueous water-containing layer on bottom. So you, of course, I'm sure are familiar with this if you've ever tried to do something like make salad dressing. Okay, so this video is kind of going long, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up with a few takeaways. Number one, all of the bodily fluids, both intracellular and extracellular fluids, these are aqueous environments. They use water as a solvent, and anything that you find in those body fluids, like sodium and potassium and glucose or anything else, they are going to be there because of their solubility in water. Number two, if solutes are to exist within these environments, they must either be soluble to begin with, and we talked about what makes a hydrophilic solute soluble in water, or there has to be some way of making them soluble. And finally, you can use the old adage in biology, like dissolves like. A polar solvent will dissolve polar solutes. A polar solvent will not dissolve a non-polar solute. Okay, so that's going to wrap up this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms I think you ought to be familiar with after watching this video. And for some check your understanding questions, number one, why is water a bent molecule instead of a linear molecule? Number two, how are hydrogen bonds important in biological molecules other than water? Number three, how are hydrogen bonds broken? And number four, how can hydrogen bonds help you predict whether a molecule will dissolve in water or not? All right, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments section, and I will see you in the next video. So long.